for us to have a copy of it to post for those who are not able to participate at this point in time. And with that, we'll get us started. A couple of other things besides the audio off. For those of you, you may want to turn your video off. We'll have, I'll probably turn my video off as soon as Chris is finished. And then, or as soon as I introduce Chris, and he'll have his on, but that keeps down the bandwidth issues that we may have. So we appreciate that. So at this time, I would like to introduce our presenter for the day, Mr. Chris Evans, who is our extension forester based in the southern part of the state, but also for those of us who worked with us, he is the invasive species guy that we all turn to. Glad to have him aboard. So with that, I see the recording has started. I will turn it over to you, Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Jay. Hopefully everybody can see me and hear me fine. I will turn my video off as well here in a second, just so you can see my full screen. You don't need to look at me anyway. But I'm very happy to present on this topic. As Jay said, I'm extension forester. I do a lot of work with invasive species. And so this is a topic that I like to talk about, and one I think is very helpful. There's a lot of content here. You could cover a whole 2-day meeting just on woody invasive plant control. So we're really going to have time to kind of scratch the surface, hit the basics, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. And then we can follow up with future webinars if we want to get into more detail on certain aspects. But I'm going to go ahead and shut my video off so that way you can see my full slides. So hopefully that'll work there. And just a quick outline, I'm going to start about some resources, some good information that you can, good places you can get a lot more information on woody invasive species, woody invasive management. Briefly talk about the biology of woody invasives and how that's important in terms of how we manage them. And then do a very quick overview of the major woody invasive species in Illinois, and with some talks about how to identify them, and then get into the meat of the talk, which is the management stuff, basic principles, control techniques, and then end with some species specific considerations. And again, hopefully we'll have time for questions as well. But when I'm talking about woody invasive plants, it's really, even though the shrubs kind of are the ones that get all the attention, right? The buckthorns and the honeysuckles. We really kind of have 3 major groupings of these woody invasive plants. And they do behave a little differently, and their management is a little bit different. But we're talking about trees, shrubs, and woody vines all together. You know, they share the characteristics of woody plants with above ground perennial vegetation, annual growth, and things like that. But these are big issues in Illinois in terms of threats to our environment, threats to our natural ecosystems and our native species. It is not surprising to find scenes like this really wherever you go in Illinois, where you have problems with these different invasive species, oftentimes more than one at a time. And we're realizing through research that there's a lot of negative impacts to these. I was in central Illinois last year or 2 years ago and came across this scene, which was a bottomland forest that should be loaded with native plants. But instead it had a thick layer of honeysuckle in the mid-story, and pretty much nothing growing underneath of it, right? And that's a huge hit to diversity, to wildlife habitat, to erosion control, flood abatement, a lot of things, a lot of services these woodlands provide for us are hampered, limited, reduced because of the presence of invasive species. You've got basically bare dirt there instead of what you should have, which is a thriving, diverse ecosystem full of native plants. And this is just what I label as a very severe bush honeysuckle infestation. We ran across this in southern Illinois, and these have been here for a long time, and some of the biggest honeysuckle plants I've seen. But just again, these are problematic species, right? Where they form dense thickets, they restrict our access to our land, our ability to use our land, the diversity, the native species as well. And so there's a need to manage these to try to restore native functioning and native ecosystems, and to manage these just to protect some of our native plants as well. Example here would be bittersweet, killing trees, right, if left alone, just absolutely overwhelming them. So that's kind of why I think this is a good topic, just because of the threat and the damage potential of these invasive species. I think that's why we need to take them seriously. We need to look at managing those, whether you're a timber person, a natural resources person, somebody that's interested in ecosystem functioning, kind of wherever you're at in this spectrum of natural resources, dealing with these woody invasives is an important part of that, especially if you're a landowner. One recent resource that's out there that just came about in the last couple years is this project called the Woody Invaders of the Great Lakes. And this is a collaborative that's made up with a bunch of different organizations throughout the Great Lakes states and provinces. University of Illinois Extension was heavily involved in this as well, or is heavily involved. And this is a website they have for this collaborative that has tremendous amounts of information and resources for a lot of invasive species. It's a site that I think anybody dealing with these should really bookmark, go back to, and look at, because it's really a wealth of information. If you dig around in there, they have a list of a lot of the different woody invasive species that occur in the Great Lakes regions. If you click on and choose one of those species, they'll have writes up about them, maps, fact sheets, websites, videos, pictures, and then a really, really detailed information section that goes into management, impacts, habitats, distribution, lots and lots of information for all these different invasive species. Also included on that website is some just general information about management of woody invasives, the different type of control techniques, things you need to consider when you're managing them, tools you may need. So it's a great resource, and one that I really would recommend anybody dealing with woody invasive species in the Midwest here to take a good close look at. A couple other resources before I get into the meat. One is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's control database. And so this is a place where you can go to look for control information that's either for experts or novices. You can put a lot of criteria in there and get a lot of good information about what works and what doesn't for these invasive species. So another great resource out there. And lastly, in terms of resources, I've got to plug our extension forestry program here at the University of Illinois. We have our Management of Invasive Plants and Pests of Illinois document that covers 42 different invasive species and gives good management recommendations for them. And we have a lot of other resources on invasives, including our Extension Forestry YouTube channel, which has recordings of a lot of different webinars and other educational programs we've done on a lot of topics, including invasives. So just a good resource as well for you. But just jumping in, woody invasive species, they share some characteristics that cross them that's important to realize when we start to manage them. And they do differ in a lot of ways from the herbaceous or annual or biennial invasive species that we deal with as well, like garlic mustard or things like that. So woody invasives, these are perennial, typically long-lived plants, right? They have above ground vegetative parts that live year to year. They slowly get bigger. Most of these woody invasive species then will sprout aggressively following damage. And so that's very important when we talk about our options for managing those. If you mechanically damage them, cut them down, mow over them or something like that, that's usually inadequate for controlling these species. They're going to sprout back from the base and grow back. Some of these are even clonal species, which means that you'll have multiple plants connected underground in the same root system. And those are even more difficult to control, because not only will they sprout back from that cut place that you cut them, but oftentimes they'll root sucker and form new plants coming out of that big root network. Again, not all of them are, but some are, and that's important to realize which ones are, and we'll talk about that. The one good thing is that the majority of these woody invasives, but not all of them, have very short-lived seed banks. And we're talking 1 to 4 years. And that's good. That's important in the sense that you're not going to have to deal with that seed bank staying there year after year after year for most of these. Now, there are some exceptions, right? Things like multiflora rose, which has 20-year plus seed banks. But most of these, we're talking a few years, which means if you can stay on it and repeat those treatments and control them for 2 to 3 years, you're really going to lower down that potential for reinvasion and coming back in. And then you're looking at more of an annual cleanup after that, as long as you can kind of get over that hump. Now, with that being said, majority of these have either bird or wind dispersed seeds, one of those two. So they do move around the landscape very efficiently and effectively. And so reinvasion from adjacent infestations spread is common and to be expected. And that's important as well. So if you know there's some of these invasive species in your area, maybe in an adjacent land, a neighbor, or down the road, the chances of it getting onto your land is pretty high because of this spread potential. And most of these are promoted by disturbance, in the sense that, and when I'm talking about disturbance, we're talking about extra light coming in with maybe a tree fall, soil exposed, something like that, that has disrupted that ecosystem. We call that disturbance, and that promotes a lot of these. And so you'll see a lot of these invasive shrubs move into an area at sites where there's disturbance. There's wind throws, maybe logging, or there's an edge where a road was put in, something that's damaged the ecosystem, changed the ecosystem, exposed soil, or opened up a niche. That's where these invasives often start to get a hold with, and they're really promoted by that. And then, of course, almost all of these that we're dealing with in terms of woody invasives were introduced to Illinois intentionally. And that is kind of an unfortunate fact, but it's something that we have to realize. I do collect these old pamphlets on invasive species back when we thought they were the best thing. And so we have one here on the left, multiflora rose, and why you should plant it as a living fence or for wildlife cover. And on the right is autumn olive and how great it is for wildlife, including the exotic ringneck pheasant, right? So these were brought over for reasons. They do have some value to wildlife or something that we wanted them here. And in those early conservationists that brought them over, in their defense, they didn't realize that the negative consequences of these species, their ability to spread, push out native species, they didn't realize that that was a thing, right? They didn't know that was going to happen. They didn't know that was going to be a consequence of introducing these. We truly thought they would be a benefit to our ecosystems. It's only in the last 20, 25 years have we really truly understood just how disruptive these species are. And we're moving away from recommending them and things like this to understanding their true impact. In terms of promoted by disturbance, this is a great example. This was in 2000, I think this picture was taken in 2010 or 2011, and it was following, it was an aerial flight we did following the 2009 windstorm in Southern Illinois. And you can see a lot of trees, tree trunks laying down there in this picture because they were blown over with this windstorm. Pretty much almost everything green in this picture is an invasive species. It was the invasives were already in this little block of woods here to a certain degree, but this disturbance, this extra light, the soil disturbance that came from this wind event just let bush honeysuckle and multiflora rose and Japanese honeysuckle particularly explode, and now it dominates this environment. So then that's just that example of disturbance. And one last picture about these topics. This is an area that had a lot of bare soil. This was an area that was cleared in kind of an old field environment that was meant to be planted into trees. And you can see here, all the gray green color is all autumn olive. the line of trees at the upper part of the picture is all black locust. And so this area was disturbed, was prepped to do some tree planting, and just got overwhelmed by these invasives. So much so that they weren't even able to plant it. And if they did plant any trees, they would have lost them as well. So there's some big management implications and impacts of these species, and really economic impacts too. So just moving into a list of the different invaders that we have in Illinois that are woody invaders, we'll start with a few of the trees. And a big one is tree of heaven. So tree of heaven is a full-size tree. It gets over 100 feet tall, 3 feet in diameter. It is one that is an interesting one because it is often misidentified. I see some people mistaking tree of heaven for walnuts because of those long pinnately compound leaves, or sumacs as well. But it is, once you know it, it is somewhat easy to identify, particularly the female plants. And when they're fruiting, and you see in the top right there, they have fruit that has a single seed with a twisting wing on either side of it, which so it means it's a wind dispersed plant. The very long leaves with lots of leaflets are not serrated like you would expect, or like walnut is. Instead, if you look at the base of each leaflet, there's going to be 1 or 2 or 3 little notches, and each notch is going to have a little dot in there, a little gland. And so that's really unique. Those big notches that are at the base of the leaflet are really unique to tree of heaven. One of the easiest ways to identify tree of heaven is to crush it up and smell it. And it smells, I like to say, kind of like rancid peanut butter. Other people have other descriptions, but it smells pretty bad. And so that's a pretty unique thing. Once you smell tree of heaven one time, you've got it forever after that. It does have smooth bark. As it gets older, it'll get kind of a diamondy look to it like that, but very smooth bark, light gray. And tree of heaven is a clonal species. It's one of those that does form these big networks underground. So you'll have these large patches like you see on the right here. Pretty much found across the state. It also is a problem because it is a host to spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect that we're very worried about showing up in Illinois. And it seems to be its life cycle is tied somewhat to tree of heaven. So the more tree of heaven we have, it raises our risk of this very problematic new invasive pest as well. The next invasive tree is colliery pear. So if you're unfamiliar with the name colliery pear, I'm sure you know some of its ornamental varieties, things like Bradford pear or Cleveland pear. A lot of these flowering pears, they're varieties of this species, the colliery pear. This is one that really has been around for a long time and was thought to have been one that behaved and was not going to spread. And it did actually not spread for quite a while. And the reason why is that the majority of the plants that were planted out in Illinois were of one variety, the Bradford pear. And that variety doesn't cross it with itself. It needs another variety to cross with. And so when we had new varieties planted and there was some genetic diversity in our ornamental choosings, that's when we started seeing this plant escape and spread throughout Illinois. And it's pretty interesting. It does look quite a bit different, the escaped ones do, from these ornamental ones in your yard. They're smaller, they're multi-stem, the leaves are smaller, and many of them actually produce some pretty nasty looking thorns on them. I've seen a lot of people mistake these for plums, things like that, just because they don't really look like the tree that you would expect in your yard, the ornamental. But they do share the same trait of blooming early. So if you go out and in early spring, it's one of the first things to flower. It often flowers before it even has leaves on it. So driving around in, say, February in Southern Illinois or March in Northern Illinois, and you see roadsides that look like this picture with all these white trees, white flowering trees, chances are you're looking at this colliery pear. And I think it's been found in every county in the state right now, and really one of our fastest spreading woody invaders. And then just one more invasive tree, and this is more of a problem in the far southern bits of the state. You don't really see Paulownia or princess tree withstanding the cold winters in the northern part of the state, but down here, we're getting more and more of this. It is really a beautiful tree in a lot of ways with those big bright purple flowers, big leaves on it, but it does have wind dispersed seeds. All the little seed pods you see there in the middle can crack open, and I think one plant is estimated to have over 1 million seeds a year, tiny little microscopic seeds that are spread by the wind, and it can just move very quickly on a landscape. This is a picture of it here in at the Ag Center where I work, and you see all the purple flowers. These are all Paulownia trees that are on the landscape here, and we've done a lot of work trying to remove them, and we've removed a lot out of the Ag Center, but we haven't got all of them yet. This one, some people mistake this a little bit for catalpas, but what you're looking at here is an opposite leaved instead of whorled, so it's 2 leaves at a time instead of 3, and it doesn't produce those long bean pods. It has little pods that almost look like pecans on it. But again, problematic in the far southern reaches of the state for sure. Moving over to the invasive shrubs, these are the ones that most people are familiar with, but we have things like autumn olive. And so if you're talking to a lot of landowners and farmers around the state, you'll hear this name, you'll hear them call this plant Russian olive. So for our purposes, they're the same thing. We do have some of the true Russian olive in Illinois, which is an invasive tree, but we have lots more of the invasive shrub, which is I'm calling autumn olive, though a lot of people call it Russian olive as well. So just know that if you're talking to somebody and they say Russian olive, the chances are they're talking about this plant. This is more of an open land species, right? It can grow in the forest and open forest, but really it's a problem. Forest edges, field edges, tree plantings, those kind of sites that have a lot of sun, that's where you're going to see this species really cause a lot of problems. It's pretty easy to identify. It's alternate leaves, and the leaves are kind of a gray-green color on top. And if you flip them over, the underside of the leaf is going to have kind of a real silver sheen to them. And so it really stands out, that silvery color. Lots of berries on them. The berries are kind of a rusty red color with a lot of little silvery dots on them as well. This plant can have thorns. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But multi-stemmed, it can get big, 30 feet tall for sure, something like that. And you can see here in kind of an open young forest, there's quite a bit of that autumn olive growing in there. It is a nitrogen fixer, and so it can actually grow in very poor sites as well. The next one is Amur honeysuckle. So we have multiple species of bush honeysuckle. Amur is the most widespread. And to me, this is the most impactful, damaging invasive we have in Illinois in terms of its ability to alter ecosystems, damage habitat for wildlife, all of this. This is, to me, #1 on the list for sure. Easy to identify, those opposite leaves, the honeysuckle flowers, although they're not very fragrant like the vine is, but still they have the same kind of flower. And then for the Amur honeysuckle, the bright red berries in the fall. And this can form some pretty dense thickets in our forest, right? And that's where it does its damage. Again, impacts to wildlife, impacts to native species, even impacting the growth rate of trees. There's a lot of impacts from this one. Another one you're likely very familiar with is multiflora rose. Multiflora rose has been around a long time. And it is one that is very widespread. We do have some native rose species, so you want to make sure that you tell the difference between them. Multiflora rose, as the name indicates, has multiple flowers, so has clusters of small, usually white, but can be pink to red flowers, and then big curved thorns. Our native roses, some have kind of straight thorns, or they'll have larger flowers that are in singles or doubles. They usually don't have those big clusters of small flowers. And then multiflora rose has leaves with a bunch of leaflets with a little feathery fringed bract at the base of the leaf. But this produces a ton of fruit. The little rose hips get spread around really easily, both in the open land and in the forest as well. And so, you know, a long-standing problem. It's been in the state for a while. It does seem to wax and wane a little bit depending on, there's a rose rosette virus that impacts it, and I've seen it knock it out for several years, and then it kind of comes back, and then it'll be there for another decade or so and then get knocked out again. So it does have somewhat of a boom and bust cycle with this virus that impacts it. Another shrub that's really catching on in Illinois, and I'm seeing it at the southern half of the state, kind of from Champaign and south, but I don't doubt that it's farther north as well, is the privets. There's at least 2 different species, European privet and blunt leaf privet, that are very similar, that occur here in Illinois. It's one that is kind of semi-evergreen. It'll hold its leaves for a while, but really, again, I'm seeing more and more of it. So it's one that we're getting kind of more concerned about. It'll have really tight, smooth gray bark, little tiny leaves that are opposite, and on little tiny side branches. And that always jumps out to me when I'm looking at privet, is that you have this smooth bark with a main stem, and the side branches kind of come out at 90 degrees from those, and they're real little. So very, very thin little side branches with lots of leaves on them. They'll have these clusters of white flowers that'll turn into dark purple berries. And, you know, it grows in the forest, grows a lot at forest edges, things like that as well. But again, moving across at least the southern half of the state fairly rapidly now. One more that's kind of another new one that I'm seeing across the entire state. It's another common ornamental, which is burning bush. Everybody's got burning bush in their yard or knows somebody that does. But we are seeing this even in fairly high quality forest nowadays. Pretty easy to identify. Burning bush is a smaller shrub. You rarely see it over 10, 15 feet tall. Has these little leaves with almost no petiole, so almost no stem to their leaf. Heavily serrated, and then most of the time, but not always, the younger, smaller stems are heavily winged. And you can see that in the pictures there on the right. They have these big corky wingings. Again, not all of them have that, but it is fairly common. And then they'll produce little berries, that's fruit that split open to show a bright red berry. And the big thing about this plant is that in the fall, it's going to have that bright, bright red coloration to its leaves that really stand out, and you can identify it from a mile away almost. The bark is really striated and stripy. And even in the winter, after it does lose its leaves, you can see those fruit just hanging on there, and it makes them really easy. So for the northern part of the state, common buckthorn definitely is public enemy #1 when it comes to woody invasives. There's so much of it up there. It is very damaging. So I'd say this is also really close to my top, on the top of my list for worst invasive species in Illinois. There's actually 2 different species of buckthorn that are common. There's the common or European buckthorn that I have pictured here, and there's a similar looking but different glossy buckthorn that also occurs in the areas it's in a little bit more wet environments, but also it's fairly common. But the common buckthorn particularly is pretty easy to identify. It'll have little serrations along the leaves. The leaves are opposite or nearly opposite. And so not always are there 2 leaves like here across from each other. Sometimes they're offset a little bit like you see here. And then if you look at the end of the branches, they'll have a little thorn sticking out. So they don't have a terminal bud like many branches do. Instead, they have a little pokey thorn sticking out, and that's their little buckthorn. They do have purple berries. If you skin the bark and look underneath of it, it'll have an orange coloration to the bark. Once you're familiar with it, it's pretty easy to identify. And it can form some pretty big thickets as well. These areas that are just very difficult to walk through. This is particularly damaging to open forest in the northern part of the state, savannas, all the way down into kind of wetland forest. You'll have problems with buckthorn. And then I've got a couple vines I'll mention before jumping into the control stuff. Two of them that I wanted to put in here. One is roundleaf bittersweet. You'll also hear it called Oriental bittersweet. But roundleaf bittersweet is a woody vine that is not super common across the state, but where you find it, can be very, very damaging. And this is the tree killer, right? It has these woody vines that'll wrap around the tree, girdle a tree. And as the vines grow and get bigger, they can literally just kill the tree from the bottom up. If that doesn't work, they'll climb over and get on top of the tree and just shade it out completely. But it is fairly easy to identify. It does have leaves that are nearly perfectly round. Sometimes they'll have a little point on them, but big round leaves, gray bark, a heavy, big woody vine. Most of our other big woody vines are going to be tan in color or dark brown in color like grapevine. This one's going to be light gray. And then when it produces fruit, it has fruit that has kind of a light, like a yellow or a light orange covering, and the fruits occurs all across the plant. And that's important because we do have a native bittersweet, American bittersweet, which has dark orange fruit color coverings, and those fruit are only at the end of the vines. The other big difference is our native American bittersweet has elongated leaves that are longer than they are wide, whereas the roundleaf bittersweet, the leaves are basically as long as they are wide. They're almost round. I find this one really easy to identify in the fall when its leaves kind of turn a bright or kind of a lime green color, almost a lime green or yellow color, and it really stands out. And so you'll see this a lot, mostly forest edges or open forest, but if it gets a hold, it can really grow even in the deep forest as well. This is another one of those clonal species. Again, so its roots are connected underground, and that makes managing it sometimes very difficult. And then the last of the invasive vines that I'll mention, the last of the species here, is Japanese honeysuckle. This is the fragrant one that you may be familiar with smelling as you're a kid, or pulling the flowers and sucking the nectar out of them as a kid. Mostly found in the southern part of the state, very, very common here, but can be found across the entire state. It's a true woody vine. It's not evergreen, but closely so. So it'll often hold leaves well into winter, and sometimes even hold a few leaves all winter. But it's going to have that stringy, papery, light brown bark. The vines will wrap around things tightly. Opposite leaves, dark green leaves, and then those white to yellow flowers are really common. And then in open environments, especially, you'll see a ton of this where it can get in there and really cause a lot of problems. So I know we have more vines than that and more other woody invasives. I just wanted to hit some of the worst ones here since we only have an hour to talk. So I'll move now into the management section of this. So now we know these invasives, how do we go about managing them, getting rid of them? And so some of the basic principles when you're looking at woody invasive management, since these are sprouters, they sprout aggressively, they live year to year through their root system and the above ground portion as well. When you're managing these, you want to either kill or remove that root system. Mowing or cutting these alone is usually not a sufficient method of control. You may delay flowering and delay fruit set. You may reduce the size of them so they're less impactful, but you're not going to get rid of them typically through mowing or cutting unless you're doing that repeated again and again. And even if you're using chemicals or doing other methods, follow-up treatments are always going to be necessary. You're going to miss some. You're going to have seedlings, there's sprouts coming in, and then like we mentioned earlier, there's always going to be re-infestations from adjacent lands because these plants move very effectively. So if you're managing these and you've got an area where you're wanting to manage woody invasives, you're never really done, right? You can control them, you can get it at a good state, but you always have to come in and follow up to look for those new ones in there, things you've missed. So while most of the work may be in those first 2 to 3 years, kind of keeping them out and inspecting your land and surveying and finding new ones should be a part of any management strategy you have. Something else that should be a good part would be just simply preventing the spread of invasive plants. So if you're out there using equipment, you're bush hogging it, or you're doing something else out there, don't accidentally drag other invasive species or move them around. So I always like to throw this in. If you're controlling some invasive species, keep your equipment clean, get seeds off of your equipment, mud out of your shoes, those things. You don't want to be causing another problem. So basic equipment cleaning, sanitation practices can really help prevent future problems. In terms of other methods, you can control these with mechanical methods if that's what you have and we want to use. So like we said, mowing, burning often aren't alone. They aren't sufficient alone. You're going to need to integrate those with other treatments or do them very repeatedly. Pulling is an option, especially for some of these that have shallower root systems, like the honeysuckles. They have fairly shallow root systems. They pull easily. Small ones can be pulled by hand. Larger ones, you can have a pulling aid like this weed wrench, or they have puller bears. There's a bunch of different kind of pulling aids you can get that help you leverage bigger plants out of the ground. Those are really great tools, especially if you're doing volunteer work days where you may not want to use heavy equipment or herbicides. You just want to have some hand tools. That's a great tool to have, again, for volunteers or people that want to kind of stay away from herbicides or other power tools. It does work for some, others it doesn't. You're limited on size, and then in species. Things like buckthorn and autumn olive particularly tend to have deeper root systems, which make it harder to use these kind of tools for those. Prescribed grazing may be an option, and that's where you bring in goats or cattle or something like that for a short duration of time to help manage the plants. I've seen that effective when used with other things. And so oftentimes you'll come in a heavy infestation to do kind of an initial attack, eat it down, reduce the size of those plants so you can control them with some other method later. It's definitely worth looking at. And then again, these mechanical methods are often integrated with treating the sprouts or something as a follow-up later. I do want to spend quite a bit of time on chemical control. Since these plants are often big, large root systems, they sprout. Chemical control is often one of the safest and most effective means of controlling these. So I do want to spend quite a bit of time on that, but I want to hit safety at first. And so anytime you're using herbicides, always use your appropriate protective gear. That's mentioned on what you need to use is on the label. Typically, that's things like safety glasses or just eye protection, long sleeves, pants, closed-toed shoes, and chemical-proof or chemical gloves like nitrile gloves or something. That's kind of the typical gear that you'll use for these using these herbicides. But again, always read and follow the label. It's the law for sure. There's several herbicides that are common that we use for controlling woody invasives. One is glyphosate. So glyphosate, which is Roundup, and there's a lot of generics. It's a non-selective broad spectrum herbicide that basically means it'll work on any actively growing plant. And there's aquatic labeled versions of it. We use this for cut stump treatments and for foliar treatments, and we'll get into that later. Another common one is triclopyr. So that's Garlon, Tahoe. There's a lot of generics. It's a big ingredient in Crossbow, which is triclopyr mixed with 2,4-D, another herbicide. This is one that does not really impact grasses, right? So if you're dealing with woody invasives in a grass setting, you can control the woody invasives and it will not really impact the grasses. There are two versions. There's one that you mix with water, which is the amine version, and there's one that's typically mixed with oil, which is the ester version, and they have different uses, right? So the amine is typically one that you'll use with a cut stump or spray in the leaves. The ester is one you'll typically use. You can use it with cut stump or spray in the bark, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you have to worry about the ester in hot conditions because it'll volatilize. Now, the one thing I have at the bottom is both of these versions are very good and good ones to work with in woody invasives, but they can be difficult to find, particularly for homeowners. So a lot of times the equivalent would be something like that Crossbow or something that's mixed with another herbicide that you can get at a farm and home store. There are some other versions out there, some homeowner versions, but that's a common one we'll use with a lot of invasives. Some other herbicides, Tordon, picloram is very, very effective on woody plants, but it tends to move easily in water or soil and can actually move through root grafts. Because of that, I typically don't recommend using it when you're working near trees that you want to keep. So if you're working in a field or a prairie and you don't necessarily have other trees you're trying to keep, close by, this is a very effective tool. If you're working under the canopy of trees that you want to keep, I tend to not recommend this one for landowners because I've seen some flashback or some movement into the desirable trees. Aminum pyralid, milestone is another one that has some selectivity and a little bit of residual, which means it sticks around in the soil for a while. But we do use this as an add-on to some of the other herbicides when we have hard to control species. And I'll talk about that in a little bit with the roundleaf bittersweet. It seems to be a really good add-on when you're trying to control it. Chloropyralid, transline, or stinger, that's one that really only works on beans and asters. So if you're going for something like kudzu, which is a bean, and you don't want to kill the trees that it's growing on, that can be a good tool. And lastly, imazapyr, so that's stalker or habitat. This is another one that kind of works on a lot of different plants. It does have aquatic labeled formulations. But kind of like the Tordon, this one has some soil residual and can move around in the soil a little bit. It's a very, very good herbicide. It works really well, but you have to kind of choose where you're going to use it. And so if you're in areas that have sandy soils or areas where you're worried about some other trees getting impacted, you may want to kind of choose how you use this one. And some of the methods we use to control these invasives, probably the most common and the ones I'm sure you're familiar with would be a cut stump treatment. So that's where you're cutting the plant down close to the ground, within a couple inches of the ground, and then you're going to treat that surface of that stump that you just exposed with a more concentrated herbicide, and that's going to be translocated down into the roots and kill the roots of that plant to prevent it from sprouting. So you'd want to cut this ideally within 2 to 3 inches of the ground, but not so close to the ground that you're getting dirt all on that cut surface. So you want to leave a little bit of a stump just to keep it clean and better able to take the herbicide. And you want to do that kind of any time of the year works well, except for the spring. Most effective is mid to late fall, but really after the plants are fully leafed out and kind of in late spring through even into winter, it's a very good method. The main thing is you want to make sure that you treat that stump within 15 minutes or so of cutting it. Anything later than that, it's not going to take up that herbicide as well. Typically, if you're not working in winter, those water-based solutions like Roundup glyphosate in water or the Garlon 3, the triclopyr in water work the best because they're more easily taken up into that cut surface. If you're working in winter, you would do an oil-based solution so it wouldn't freeze on you. And you want to treat the entire surface of smaller stems. So if it's less than, say, 2 inches in diameter, just go ahead and treat that whole surface. If it's larger than that, then really you only have to treat that outer inch or so of the stem, because that's where the living tissue is. That's where you're going to spray the herbicide to get taken down into that root system. And I like using an herbicide dye because I think it really helps me figure out what's going on and that I don't miss anything. Basil bark is another one that's similar to cut stump, but the nice thing about it is you actually don't have to cut the plant down. So you're looking at thin barked species and you're just spraying the herbicide, and you want to use that ester-based herbicide like we talked about with triclopyr, and oil-based herbicide, and you spray it right on the bark and it gets taken up through the bark and then slowly kills that plant. It does use a little more herbicide than cut stump, but it leaves the vegetation standing, and you can let it stand there and die that way. So it tends to be fairly fast. And this is a really common one you'll see with like autumn olive or something like that, where they're branchy, they're kind of hard to get in there anyway to cut. So you can come in with a long wand on an herbicide sprayer and do this kind of treatment. Very effective. Again, those ester formulations in oil work really well. Smaller stemmed woody plants, thin, smooth bark works really well. And you just leave the plant standing. Now, the big thing that scares people when they do this, if they treat it in the winter or the late fall, a lot of times those plants will leaf out a little bit in the spring and you worry about it, but oftentimes they'll leaf out and then wilt and die in the spring, I've seen. Some things you need to be worried about when you're using both of these. Again, you have to choose your herbicides, and that imazapyr and that picloram, so the tordon and the arsenal, those move through the root grafts. And so both of those you want to be careful with doing this. They can be very effective, but you don't want to apply too much. You don't want to get much of it on the soil because you're going to worry about hitting other plants that you don't want to kill. There is another method called injection, which is similar to cut stump, but you don't actually cut it all the way down. You just put like a hack into it. Sometimes they call it hack and squirt, and you then put the herbicide right in that little cut you made. That's very fast, works fairly well on the right species. And so we do that a lot for tree species, young tree species. Tree of Heaven's a great example that we use this method a whole lot as well. It's fast and quick, and you don't have to cut the whole tree down that way. And then there's foliar treatments. And so this is where you're actually treating the leaves of the plant. This is probably what you're most familiar with when you talk about using herbicides. You're treating the leaves will then take up the herbicide, and it's usually a very dilute formulation of the herbicide, and bring it down to the roots and kill the plant that way. It's important that you don't need to put too much on there. You don't want to spray it so heavily that herbicide is dripping off of these plants. You just want to get a good thorough coverage. You get kind of a fine network of dots of herbicide on the leaves. That's going to be adequate. The foliage does need to be healthy and actively growing to be able to use this. You want to have green foliage. It doesn't, if it's yellowing in the fall, it's not going to take up the herbicide. If it's under drought stress, or if it's too cold, it doesn't work. So you need a healthy, actively growing plant to be able to kill it with a foliar herbicide, which sounds kind of funny. So for example, this is some bush honeysuckle right here. You can see that the majority of this plant is already yellow in color. This is too past it. So this plant is not going to take up that herbicide very well if you spray the leaves. You could spray the leaves, but you would not get a good kill on this plant because you're not going to translocate that herbicide down. So if a plant looks like this with thinning or yellowing vegetation in the fall, you're kind of too late to spray the foliage. You're going to have to try something different. And we use things like backpack sprayers. Here's a good look at some herbicide dye with honeysuckle. You can see we got a good network of the dots on there, but it's really not dripping off. That's kind of what you're looking for. And then just a little note about that, if you are mowing or controlling plants and they're going to sprout back, we often use a foliar spray to treat those sprouts. So if you mow a plant down or cut it at the ground level and then it starts to sprout, you're going to want to wait for those sprouts. If you spray them at the size that they are, like on these pictures, you're not going to be able to get enough herbicide down into those roots to kill them. So you actually have to wait a little bit. Let those sprouts get up to 18 to 24 inches tall just to get enough leaf area to take up the herbicide to kill that plant. So you have to be patient and don't spray it too early when you're trying to treat sprouts. And then just a couple things here to mention. If you have very heavy, severe infestations, there are some options for you. In Illinois, we've had some really good luck using aerial control. So these are heavy infestations where you're looking at 75+% of the ground cover is an invasive. You can come in the fall. There's a little bit of a time there where the leaves are dormant on the overstory trees, the trees that are growing in there, but the honeysuckle's still green, that you can get really good control at that point without damaging your trees. So we're finding that, and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is really taking the lead on this, that this tends to be one of the most cost-effective techniques in terms of per acre cost to control these heavy infestations, where they're getting good control from anywhere from $25 to $100 an acre, which is really, really good. but you do need enough acres to make that work, right? So 80 acres or so is about the break to make it be cost effective. And they're achieving on good spray events 75+% control, and they're having even better luck if they follow up that fall application with a prescribed fire that next spring, and then some spot treatments after that. It's really good combination to kind of knock these out. Another thing for these heavy infestations that some people are having really good luck with would be mist blowers. So that is kind of you cut paths through a heavy infestation and you drive an ATV through there with a mist blower, and it kind of moves the herbicide into the heavy invasive area, especially if you have a light wind. And people are having pretty good luck with that, controlling honeysuckle, particularly. Again, these really heavy infestations where you're just trying to get it down to a manageable amount. And then lastly, for these heavy infestations, we are doing a lot of work with forestry mulching right now, where we have a skid steer, a big machine that basically grinds down the invasives to the ground, and then you come back in the next year and you treat those stumps. This is something where you have those really, really heavy infestations that you can't even walk through. You don't even know where to start. A machine like this could be very effective. And we're using this the last year or two here at the Ag Center where I work, because we've had some really bad infestations of autumn olive and at the edges particularly, and we're coming in and getting them down to the ground and then coming back and sprout and treating those sprouts. It seems to be very effective for us, and is really one of the few ways that you can easily address these really, really heavy infestations. And so I'll mention a few kind of species specific things here at the end. And the first of that is working with these clonal species. And I mentioned them a few times here. So black locust, tree of heaven, and roundleaf bittersweet are some of the worst clonal species that are connected underground into these big networks. With these, you want to stay away from mowing them or cutting them and trying to do a cut stump, because that damage that you're doing often stimulates that root suckering. And you can go from having, say, 4 or 5 big tree of heaven trees to having 2,000 suckers like all in there. And so it's really a problem. So I tend to avoid those. Instead, I would prefer to use basil barks, or that injection, that hack and squirt, or frill they call it. Or if it's small enough, you can spray the foliage. Those kind of methods don't tend to stimulate root suckering as bad as the cut stump or mowing it down does. And so those methods, usually you get better success than you do otherwise. And so any of those clonal species, that's kind of the direction that I would recommend going. And for example, this is an area that we did some work where we had a lot of roundleaf bittersweet, and we came in and did a basil bark where we're spraying the oil-based herbicide right on the vines, and had really, really good luck with initial kill and didn't have a lot of that suckering afterwards. And so we were really happy with that. And so I will end, I see I've got about 5 minutes left. I will just end with some species specific considerations. So I didn't talk about particular rates or anything yet, because that varies depending on the herbicide, but just thinking about certain species. And just quickly, with bush honeysuckle, the triclopiers and stuff don't work as well on those. We've had better luck with glyphosate, and it seems to be that's the herbicide of choice, both for spraying the foliage and cut stump on it. Seems to work really well. Now for autumn olive, it's kind of the opposite, where we've had not great results using glyphosate, but we do have good results with triclopier, the garlands and those, and the basil bark applications work really well for it. And I'll just add, for multiflora rose, we've done, mowing it and then treating the sprouts work really well, but I'll just reiterate with this one, it varies where you're at in the state. Sometimes, some places it's in decline because of this rose rosette virus. Bittersweet, we just talked about, that basil bark seems to work really well for it, especially if you got a bunch of it, and not mowing or cut stump is something you need to consider. And then lastly, with Japanese honeysuckle, that's something I consider conditional control, in the sense that if you have a little bit of it under a forest, I wouldn't necessarily think you would need to control it, but you want to control it in those areas where it's really causing problems. Prescribed fire seems to work really well to keep it in check, or those kind of late fall treatments seem to work pretty well. And so again, that was really quick. This is something that you could spend a couple days talking about, but I just wanted to hit the highlights for you all and kind of cover some things. And we have a few minutes here. I'm happy to take questions if we have any, and whatever we need to do.
Chris,
So
we do. Thank you, Chris. And we do have a few questions for you here.
okay.
Carol asked, are all of these plants listed as invasive in Illinois, i.e. can no longer be sold here? And are they illegal to plant now?
Good question. Not all of them. Quite a few of those are, yes. So the honeysuckles, the autumn olives are, but some of those are still available to be bought, but not all of them, basically. We are encouraging people to find alternatives, whether they're native or non-invasive alternatives to things like the Bradford pears and the burning bush, but those currently in Illinois are not illegal to sell.
All right. Next one is for larger honeysuckle stumps, is painting on brush killer an option? Is it effective? I think you kind of covered this, but
I did. So the brush, like if you buy just straight up brush killer with that name, that's often going to be that triclopyr, and that's usually not effective on the honeysuckles. Instead, I would buy something that has the glyphosate, the Roundup, or one of the generics. That's going to work better, and you would mix it with water and use it for honeysuckle. You'll have better luck with that.
Next one is some of the participants answered the question, but also what was the lever called that for removing the sprouts? Now, you threw out a couple of different names there.
I did. There's a bunch of those out there, right? So I'm not recommending one over the other, but the original one was called the weed wrench. It's not really found anymore. There's the puller bear, and that's P-U-L-L-E-R, puller bear. There's the extractigator. There's the honeysuckle popper. I think each company is fighting each other to have the punniest name out there.
Will the hack and squirt method work for young 1 to 2 inch the Kepler buckthorn?
Yes. Yeah, it works pretty well for that.
Okay. Any suggestions for finding company to identify all the buckthorn in a yard or treated area, small suburban lot?
Finding a company to do that?
Yeah, find it. Yeah.
No, I don't know. You could look at, you just want to ask around and what landscape or company or environmental company that does that kind of work. You want to find somebody with experience, but I don't have particular recommendations for one over the other.
Right.
Just do your homework, right? Yeah.
Exactly. There's a question about what about prickly ash?
So prickly ash is a native. It's a native species that can get into some pretty dense thickets. And so people do manage it at times. You can manage it with fire, you can spray it and do some of the same techniques, but understand that it is a native species. And so it behaves a little differently, or I treat it a little differently than these invasives in that case.
Had one here. What would you recommend for stump treatment for buckthorn, which would not harm surrounding trees?
So you could use the garlands, the triclopyrs, but you'd want to use it, at the right rates. You could use it at the big challenge with buckthorn is it grows so dense. You're putting so much herbicide on the ground, and so that you want to be careful about that. So sometimes if you have very, very dense infestations, you're going to take smaller bites of it at a time instead of treating the whole thing and then spraying everything at one time because you're putting so much herbicide on the ground. But the triclopyrs work really well for that. That would probably be my recommendation. Just again, if you very, very like dog hair, thick stands of it, take smaller bites is probably your best bet.
Okay. Got a couple of questions here about tree of heaven. What's the best for tree of heaven foliage? And then what do you squirt if you hack and squirt on a tree of heaven?
So tree of heaven is probably going to be one of the most difficult plants that I've mentioned here to control because it has such a well-developed root system and it suckers so well. We've used everything, we've tried everything from glyphosate and triclopyr on tree of heaven with mixed results. What really works the best is the imazapyr, that arsenal or stalker I talked about. You just have to be careful by putting too much of it in an area where there's trees that you want to save. But that's probably your best bet for control tree of heaven, is that herbicide for a hack and squirt. The other ones work okay. It's just going to take multiple treatments to get it because it's a difficult plant to control because of all that root system it has.
Okay. Any recommendations on Japanese knotweed?
Oh, man.
That's a whole different presentation.
That's a whole different presentation. Japanese knotweed is very difficult. Like I said, with tree of heaven, Japanese knotweed has even a worse root system, and it's kind of a little bit situationally dependent. A lot of times knotweed grows next to the water systems, and so you're limited on what you can use in those situations to aquatic labeled herbicides. In that case, if you have a small infestation, we've actually had really good luck with cutting the stems, and they're hollow, and so you would basically dribble into that cut surface that you just created by cutting that stem into that hollow, kind of like concentrated glyphosate into there. And if you're near a stream, you would want to use an aquatic labeled version. That's very labor intensive, but for small infestations, it works pretty well. For the larger infestations, that milestone, the aminopyrrolid, seems to have some really good activity on it. Yeah, that's probably the best one, the milestone. Some people have used some other ones, but with hit or miss techniques.
Okay, so there's a couple of them here. There's a question about what works on poison ivy. Got a large vine growing a tree. Cut it. Well, if you might could read that very last one there. Also a question about similar question about grapevine, wild grapevine.
Okay, so for poison ivy, if you got a big vine climbing a tree, the big thing about it is if you just do a cut, so you just put a cut in that vine and sever that vine and that's it, those plants can actually grow around and reconnect themselves. And I've seen that. It's amazing what those plants can do. So what I would recommend doing is you actually want to cut a section, 4-inch section or more out of that vine and get it out of there. That way, the stuff that's still in the tree and the stuff that's connected to the root system, they're not going to be able to reconnect themselves. So cut a big chunk, a 4-inch chunk out of there, knock it out of there, and then treat that cut surface on the lower one with herbicide. You can use glyphosate, triclopyr, whatever you want to do, you can do that. And that's going to, at least for sure, kill the top portion of that vine that's growing into the tree. Now, sometimes that can hold on for quite a while and remain green and look like things are going fine, but it will eventually die as long as you prevent it from reconnecting itself into that root system.
Okay.
Now,
there's one here.
Grapevine's a little different. So grapevine is not a plant that's going to attach itself to a tree like poison ivy does, right? So trumpet vine does. Poison ivy, winter creeper attaches to a tree. Grapevine is a loose vine that kind of loosely climbs up a tree. So you have a little less worry about that. But again, grapevine's a native. If you can tolerate some of it, it's wonderful for wildlife. If you're worried about your timber quality, then you want to thin it. You want to thin that grapevine a little bit out of your trees, but keep some around just because it's probably one of the best wildlife plants out there on the landscape.
There's one question in here about being a McHenry County homeowner battling buckthorn in wooded area. Cut it down, stayed on top of the growth, Does it also make sense to start putting some native species?
That's a really good question. And absolutely, the problem with these invasives is that if they're there for a long time, they often kind of either depleted the seed bank of native species or overwhelmed the seed bank of native species. So there's not a lot that come back in other than other invasives. So in those situations where you have big, heavy stands, you probably do want to look at replanting. Now, you want to be careful and not do that too early. If you replant too early, before you've really got a handle on your invasive, like buckthorn in this case, you're going to then have to try to control the buckthorn when you've got these young little plants you're trying to save all around them. So I typically recommend, get your stuff under control, get the invasives under control at a pretty good level before you start planting desirable species in there, just to save yourself some headaches in the future. But having, good native species, diversity in there, thick growing natives is certainly going to help keep new invaders out. So that's something you should certainly look at, and it could be very effective.
Kind of a good wrap up connected question that is one here. I've always heard that the seed bank could live for 20 plus years in many of these invasives, but you made the comment earlier that just a few years. Is this a new discovery and have I been misled?
It might have been a bit of a misunderstanding, right? So there are plenty of invasives that have long-lived seed banks. So don't get me wrong with that. Lespedizas particularly, right? 50 years is probably within the realm of possibility for those. Garlic mustard, you're probably looking at close to a decade, so forth and so on. What I'm talking about are many of these woody invasives, with the exception of a few, have these fleshy fleshy fruit with seeds that only live a year or two in the soil. So that's a subset of the invasive. So buckthorn to a lesser degree, honeysuckles, bittersweets, these you can expect their seeds to live 1 to 2 years in the soil. Tree of heaven's a little longer, multiflora rose is 20 to 30 years. So it does vary, but the majority of these woody ones we're talking about have much more short-lived seed banks as compared to garlic mustard or some of these herbaceous ones. And if I can just go on a little bit, the reason why is that these are perennial plants. They are not relying on their seeds to continue their populations from year to year like an annual or a biennial are. They rely on their root system. So they put more energy and more effort into their root system. And then for their fruit, their seeds, they give fleshy fruits because they want to spread them out and spread. So it's a kind of a little bit of a different ecological strategy when you have a long-lived perennial plant versus an annual or biennial that has to survive via their seeds.
Okay. A couple things. Notice that we're a little bit after the hour, so would like to thank everybody who was here. Chris, I think you and I both can stick around here and answer a few more of these questions you want to, but want to let folks know that really appreciate them being here. We'll have another one of these next month, and I apologize for not knowing what the topic is right off the top of my head, but do appreciate everybody participating. If you've got a question in here, we can actually, I guess, set this up where we can open the mics up, but got a couple more questions in here we can answer, but wanted to give folks a chance in case they need to get back to work to go away and to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. Yep. And I think if people want to unmute, they certainly can now. I think we've got it set up that way.
Yeah. We had one question here. Whoops. As it goes, question about buckthorn growing in the middle, right in the middle of viburnum and chokeberry.
Yeah, in that case, you just want to be precise in your application. You can control it. You can cut the buckthorn down if you can get to it. And that's where you would want to use maybe like a paintbrush or something, or a dabber, something to really put that herbicide just on that plant that you're trying to apply. And I've done that before, and you can control 2 plants that are touching. You can kill one and leave the other one, as long as you're precise.
Okay.
And I see that Gene just put a question about how much of the root system do you have to remove. So if you want to, it depends on the species, but honeysuckle is nice that it does not tend to sucker from the root system. Instead, it sprouts from your root collar. So with that one, as long as you remove that heart of that root collar, and you break a few smaller roots off here and there, you're not, those smaller roots that you break off are likely not to result in a new honeysuckle plant. It's that big root collar that you want to get out of there. And so that's another reason why honeysuckle is a pretty good plant for using those mechanical extractor tools, right? Because once you get the heart of that plant out, you're probably not going to get a sprout coming back.
I think we got most of them. There was a question about, is glyphosate has it gotten a bad rap over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, it has in some ways, and I know that's something that it's in the media a lot right now. But if you look at glyphosate and you look at like using it correctly and using it following the label guidelines, which is using the right PPE and things like that, it seems to be a very safe and effective tool that is right now kind of in the media a lot. And I think some of that's quite a bit overblown, in my opinion.
Did have a question about how to kill wisteria.
Ooh, that's a tough one too. So wisteria is another one that is a vine that will grow along the ground. It'll root in multiple places. It is similar to bittersweet in that sense that it's going to take multiple treatments. Basil bark is a good option for it. You want to be careful cutting it because you're going to have a lot of suckers with that as well. But any of these big woody vines or things that have a big root system, it's just, you can't expect to have one treatment and then be done. It's just going to take follow-up treatments and a lot of work. And that's just something that I think we need to plan for and budget for. And I see Sarah asked, any issues leaving honeysuckle branches to break down in the woods? No, not really. I think you can do that. What you want to be careful about would be if you pull up a plant and then just lay that plant roots and all on the ground. If it's wet conditions, there's an outside chance that it could reroot. But if you're just talking about branches and things, they break down fairly quickly. And I don't think that any allelopathic properties would persist for any amount of time. So I don't see any problem just leaving them in the woods.
I've looked back through them and I'm not finding, I may have missed a question there. If I did, I apologize for that. Please feel free to send Chris or I a note about it. We'll get an answer back to you. But at this point,
Wait a minute.
Okay.
I got one quick question, please.
Okay.
Once a tree has been sprayed, can it be burned?
Yes, so you can. So the herbicides typically break down fairly quickly. And if you're spraying the stump, you're not going to burn it. It's just on the ground anyway. The top part is fine. But if it's a bush and you're spraying all the foliage on it, you want to give it time to die and take up the herbicide. But yeah, you could burn that and without a problem.
Okay. See, we had one, and this is one that you and I often forget. This question about burning bush being in there and about pulling it out of their decorative thing. And I think it's one of the things for all of those plants.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to tell people that they need to get rid of and spend a lot of expense putting new plants in. What I would say is if you're at a point where you're looking at changing your landscaping anyway, or you're making some planting choices, at that time, it's really probably a good idea to steer away from some of these invaders. Understanding that, it's not a bad thing to get rid of it, but I'm not going to recommend necessarily that there's a lot of expense. So I'm not saying you need to do that, but it wouldn't hurt, right? Basically,
Exactly.
especially when you're doing new plantings to kind of move away.
If you're thinking about redecorating, redoing your landscaping, that's when to get rid of it.
Exactly.
Otherwise, well, just gotta be careful with it.
Yep.
So at that, if we don't have any others, thank you, Chris. Thanks to all of you, and have a good rest of your afternoon then.
Great. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.